Hi everyone, so today's video we are going to be talking about the short-run Phillips curve, what it really is and what does it show, how do we draw it, etc. etc. So the short-run Phillips curve was essentially came about in the 1950s to talk about the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, because there is a trade-off between them. Now, what do we mean by trade-off between them? We can see that easily through a regular ADAS diagram, aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. So let's see that. So on the y-axis, as usual, we take the price level, and on the x-axis, we take the real GDP, right? And I'm going to go ahead and draw a downward sloping aggregate demand curve and an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, right? Now we know that if the aggregate demand increases, okay, let's say we started off at this point where this was the real GDP and this was the price level, and then the real GDP increased to Y2 and the price level as a result increased to PL2. Now the reason that the price level increased, we know this is called demand pull inflation, is because the aggregate demand increased. Since the aggregate demand increased, there was an upward movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve. What that means is that there were more quantities of goods and services being produced in order to meet the increased aggregate demand. So as a result, there is more output in the economy and there is a higher inflation. Now that more output required more workers to be producing those goods and services, which means obviously unemployment has decreased, as we can see here. Unemployment has decreased and price level has increased. So we can definitely see that trade-off in our ADAS diagram. But what if we want to show that trade-off by graphing unemployment rate and inflation rate rather than price level and real GDP? That's where the short-run Phillips curve comes in handy, because it's a good way of showing this trade-off visually, right? So it's just a visual representation of that trade-off. So how do we draw it? I'll draw it here on the right. I'm just making some space for it on the board. Okay. So I hope that's visible. Starting off with just drawing a y-axis and an x-axis, and on the y-axis, because it's price level on the y-axis on our ADAS diagram, we'll take the inflation rate over here. Now remember that the inflation rate is not the same as a price level, right? The price level might increase, inflation rate will be very different, right? Because we have studied about something called as disinflation also. Disinflation is basically where there is inflation in the economy but at a decreasing rate, which means at that particular year there will not be an increase in inflation rate because the inflation rate has actually decreased, but there is inflation in the economy. So the price level would definitely still show that increase in price level. So this and this is not the same thing. However, because they're similar, they're taken on the, this is taken on the y-axis because it's similar to like price level. Just remember it like that. And this is the real GDP. Now the unemployment is not shown in this graph, but in this graph we want to take the unemployment rate on the x-axis. So I'm just going to write unemployment rate over here. So how does the short-run Phillips curve look like? Well, you just want to show your corresponding point. So let's say I call this A and I call this B. So I want to show A. So I can show a point A over here. okay? And at A, this is the unemployment rate and this is the inflation rate, whereas B, which is showing a lower unemployment rate, would come somewhere over here because it is a lower unemployment rate and a higher inflation rate. So that's B. So basically my short-run Phillips curve will look something like this, right? Give or take. This is your short-run Phillips curve. Okay, so it's downward sloping like this, pretty similar to the shape of the aggregate demand curve, although it will be more curved in nature. So you want to draw it like this, just a curve. And it shows the relationship between unemployment and inflation because at the point A, this is the unemployment rate and this is the inflation rate, whereas at the point B, you have a lower unemployment rate but a higher inflation rate. And you can clearly see that trade-off happening. So this was basically the theory, what the theory said of Phillips curve, short-run Phillips curve theory, said that there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So governments can actually choose which macroeconomic objective they want to stress on at that particular point of time. We know that demand side policies like fiscal policy and monetary policy can be used to solve these problems of unemployment and inflation. So the government just has to look at what's the particular context and the circumstance in the economy, what is its priority at the moment, and can choose which goal they want to focus on, which macroeconomic objective they want to focus on. Do they want to get down inflation at the cost of unemployment or get down unemployment at the cost of inflation? It's quite obvious that unemployment is definitely not something which a lot of people, a lot of citizens would want. So that is definitely always an important goal. But again, it really depends on what is the situation of the economy, right? Now, this theory is all very well, but during the 80s, something called a stagflation hit the economy. Stagflation was basically the stagnation of the economy coupled with inflation. So over here, we are just talking about demand pull inflation, but we did study another type of inflation called as cost push inflation, right? So how do you show cost push inflation through the short-run Phillips curve? You can't really show that because cost push inflation is when the inflation is increasing and at the same time unemployment is also increasing. This is due to a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve rather than a shift in the aggregate demand curve, right? So let's just draw the diagram for cost push inflation. So I'm drawing it over here. Start with price level on the y-axis and real GDP on the x-axis, and my downward sloping aggregate demand curve, upward sloping SRAS curve. Now over here, I'm just going to mark the output, that is the real output and the price level. Remember, this is real output, real GDP, national income. It has many names, right? And so don't get confused when I use those different terms. They're basically synonyms of one another. And then we want to show a leftward shift in short-run aggregate supply, because that is what is cost push inflation. It means that the costs of production are really high, and because of high costs of production, the supply is going to reduce. Now, due to the reduced supply, obviously, the real GDP is going to decrease, right? Price level is going to increase. Okay, so decrease of short-run aggregate supply leads to increase in the price level. Increase in the price level leads to an upward movement along aggregate demand curve. and there is, less income in the economy, unemployment has increased. This is a bad situation for the economy. Economy is going into, lesser and lesser employment, and at the same time there is an increase in price level. So this was called as stagflation when it happened, and it mostly happened because of the the supply side shock of oil being less in the economy, where OPEC had restricted the supply of oil in the economy. So now because of that, there was a supply shock, there was stagflation. How do you show it? Basically the theory fell flat. They said that we can't really show it using this, because if we really want to show this leftward shift in SRAS, we cannot show it having a movement along the short-run Phillips curve. So how do we show it? So let's try a short-run Phillips curve for this situation. So on the y-axis, we take inflation rate, and on the x-axis, we take the unemployment rate. So let's again mark our points. This one is A and this one is B. So you want to show A over here. And what about B? How do you show that? Now we know with B, what's happening is that inflation is also increasing and unemployment is also increasing. So I can't put B over here, which means that, because if I put B over here, it means a lower unemployment rate. But I want to show a higher unemployment rate, which means I will have to put B after A. So over here, so that means higher unemployment rate and higher inflation rate, right? So it can't come in this short-run Phillips curve, but I can draw another short-run Phillips curve and say that there has been a shift in the short-run Phillips curve due to stagflation. So the shift of the SRAS to the left actually means the rightward shift of the SRPC, or the short-run Phillips curve. So that's an important way to remember how to graph it, is that whenever you're showing cost push inflation or a shift of SRAS to the left, you want to show a shift of SRPC to the right to actually graph that trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So this happens when there is a supply side shock. However, when we talk about a shift of aggregate demand, that is shown on the short-run Phillips curve as a movement along the SRPC. So it's like a rightward AD shift, means a leftward movement along SRPC, and a leftward SRAS shift means a rightward shift of SRPC. It's something like, it's like the opposite basically of this. So it's just a way to remember, and you know the reason why it is graphed this way. So this is about the short run Phillips curve, but there is also something called as the long run Phillips curve, which we will see in the next video. Thank you.